Cook County Jail. We arrived in Chicago at about 7:30 that evening and went straight to Cook County Jail. Inside the jail, they pat searched me and took me downstairs. The assistant superintendent, a white cat, started telling me on the way downstairs that he had gotten to know Fred Hampton very well, while Fred Hampton was in jail there one time. Footnote: Fred Hampton, 22, chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party, was shot and killed in his sleep on December 4th, 1969 at 5 a.m. when the Chicago police raided his house, allegedly looking for an arsenal of guns. And the footnote. I asked the cat what his job was. He told me he used to be a police officer in charge of gang intelligence. Naturally, I didn't trust him in one bit, so instead of offending him, I just let him go on and present himself to see what his attitude really was. He went on to say that he had liked Brother Fred Hampton very much. I was not impressed. That sounded like gang intelligence work. He took me downstairs into a hall, and there was a black cat standing there. I had heard that there was a black man who ran the jail. Moore was his name. He was the head superintendent there. They called him Warden Moore. Moore told the assistant, "Bring him in here. I want to talk to him." So I walked into the little room. He said, "Sit down over there in the chair." I sat down in the chair. "Now look here," he said, like he was supposed to be very tough. "I'm the warden of this jail, and I run this jail. You got a lot of notoriety, and we don't want any trouble in this jail." I looked at him and I said very straight and very directly, "I know you don't want me to organize in your jail. Most people don't want me organizing in their jails when I am there." Moore said, "We haven't got any Panthers in this jail. We haven't got any Muslims in this jail. We haven't got any gang members in this jail. We got inmates. You understand that?" "Yes," I answered. "I also understand that I'm still the chairman of the Black Panther Party. I want my cell and my legal papers so that I can get work done on some legal matters." Moore said, "You'll get your cell all right." Another guard came in, a black cat, and took me into another section where they do the booking. They strip searched me, then gave me my clothes back. I noticed that there were a lot of black guards at Cook County Jail. After this procedure was finished, they had some sheets of paper that I had to fill out. One for my property and for receiving mail, and one for listing all my arrests. The last one is called the rap sheet. I took the sheet and started filling it out. I didn't have to give this information to them, and the average cat should just flat take his Fifth Amendment and refuse to give any such information. But in my case, I knew that this kind of information is already known by every FBI agent, so it would have been silly to refuse to run it down. Well, the next thing I knew, about 30 black guards crowded around and began to ask me questions about all the past arrests I had. I guess they were curious from having heard so many lies in the newspapers. So really, enthusiastically, they gathered around to hear what I would tell about what had happened in the past, about what they would call my criminal record. Some of them seemed to think that I had been arrested for some vicious crimes. When I mentioned that I had been arrested for having a gun adjacent to a jail, there were oohs and ahs and expressions toward each other as if they thought that this must have been some fantastic feat or criminal act that I was trying to pull, which was not the case at all. The fact was, this was right after one of the times Huey had gotten busted. At the time of Huey's arrest, we were carrying weapons, and I was waiting outside the jail for him on a public sidewalk with a shotgun in my hands. The next day, I was arrested. These are the kinds of things they didn't know. The fact that I wasn't even arrested initially, and that I wasn't trying to break anybody out of jail. We just carried the guns in the open at the time to show the people that it was legal to carry these guns, and that we would defend ourselves. We had been on the streets with guns for 6 or 7 months by that time, and the cops hadn't arrested us because they couldn't find anything to charge us with until we happened to get too near a county jail. So I explained to the guards, don't look at that like it's something fantastic. It's perfectly legal for a person to arm himself and have a shotgun. We just got too near a county jail. They looked at me skeptically and said, "Oh, come on now. What else you been arrested for? Come on, what else?" I realized that they didn't know any of the facts about my arrest at all, just that there had been a lot of these arrests. They made a long list on the rap sheet, looking very sensational. They wanted to know, who is this Bobby Seale person who has all this notoriety? Most of them were thinking that I was really a gangbanger, stuff like this, which I wasn't at all. I had never been a gang leader. I was just another cat who grew up in the community. But they were looking for a lot of theft and other bad things. So I told them I'd run it all down in detail, but I wouldn't say anything about any case that was still pending. Anything they wanted to know from the past, I'd freely tell them. I've been arrested 5 times in the last 2 years on major things that were trumped up by the government to try and put me in jail. But other than that, before these last 2 years and before the Black Panther Party, there was nothing more serious than traffic warrants. Since the party was founded, there was the guns on grounds adjacent to a county jail charge. Then my wife and I were both arrested for possession of illegal weapons. The initial charge on that was a so-called kind of conspiracy to commit murder, which they had to drop the next day. The guards grabbed onto that. "Why'd they drop it?" they asked. "What you mean? What happened then?" But I wouldn't go any further into that because it's still pending on appeal. Then there was the bust in Sacramento, and then the Chicago thing, and the Connecticut murder charge, which hasn't come to court yet. These are all my arrests. Finally, the guards were satisfied. I was ready to be taken up to my cell. A black guard who knew Oakland told me he was taking me up, and I told him I wanted my own cell. I explained that I could work better that way. He said, "Yeah, man, I'll make sure you get a place where you can work and do your things." As we walked to my cell, he talked about Oakland, but it was like we were talking about 2 different places because he hadn't been there for a long time. He was a lieutenant. One thing I found among those black guards was that even though they were being used by the system to check and corral their own black brothers, half of them were doing it just for the sake of having a job. There's so much unemployment in the black community that regular everyday cats will take a job as a guard just to be able to get by. Some of the older cats and a few others try to play policeman and be tough. They're so brainwashed, they can't see beyond the man system. But this one cat, this lieutenant, happened to have grown up in Berkeley and Oakland with me when I was younger. He remembered the same people I remembered at Berkeley High. When I was working in the poverty program, way before the Black Panther Party was formed, he was the head of a local poverty program. But he was the type of cat that's just going to take him a job, get a position, and not really be that concerned with black people in black America and the struggle. Some places in the jail, I saw some filth around the walls that really needed cleaning. When we got to my cell, I was relieved to see that it wasn't filthy around the walls and floor. The cell was a maximum holding cell, tiny and certainly not comfortable, but at least it was empty and clean. The guard left and I went to sleep. The next morning, Warden Moore came to pay me a call. I heard some steps. Somebody was walking down the hall trying to be very quiet. I sat with my back to the steel door. I remembered the sound it had made the night before when the guard pushed to open it. Very loud, very startling. A good way to scare a person and make him jump. A good way for a soft-stepping warden to intimidate a prisoner by startling him and putting him on the defensive. Sure enough, the soft sounds stopped. Bang! My door opened. I waited for a few seconds and then looked around slowly. It was Warden Moore. He stared hard at me, then said rather arrogantly, "How you doing?" "I'm doing fine, Warden. How you doing?" I was just sitting sort of casually on the top bunk. He looked at the papers I had spread around me and nodded at them, demanded, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm thinking about my legal matters, working on that stupid trumped up charge there," and I pointed to a legal document that Gary had given me. "What charge is that?" Moore sort of growled, and I handed him the charge from Connecticut. He looked at it and read it. Then he handed the paper back to me and stepped back, putting his hands in his belt, trying to look authoritative. "We've got over 2,000 prisoners in this jail," he announced. "We run this jail just fine. We got over 90% black guards in this jail." "Good," I said. "In fact, I was surprised to see that many black people running a jail." He cleared his throat. "You want to go outside?" he asked. "It doesn't make any difference," I told him. "I can be locked up, or I can go outside, or I can just stay right here." Then he said I could go watch television if I wanted to with some trustees. "No thanks," I told him. "I don't have to watch TV. I just as soon stay locked up right in here." He stared at me for a few seconds. He looked a little confused when I said that. Then he turned and left. That was a little trick I had learned from Huey. Huey would upset the guards in jail. Huey understood the guards. He knew that psychologically most guards couldn't stand to be locked up. Most believed they would go mad if they had to be locked up. So what Huey would do is, when they put him in the day room, all of a sudden he would jump up and say, "Hey officer, come here and lock me back up in my cell." He pulled the reverse on them. Where most prisoners would do nearly anything to get out of their cells and into the day room, Huey would say, "Lock me up in my cell." Huey said the guards are really the ones who fear jail and fear the things they do there, because they would fear being in the same situation as the prisoners. The worse they treat the prisoners, the more they fear. That's the mind of the establishment. There were other experiences Huey had told us about to help us deal with the situations we would find in jail. One time, a long time ago, before the Black Panther Party, Huey was put into the hole. They brought him some mush in a cup for him to eat and some water. The mush was green, so he took the stuff and threw it out the porthole, and then sat down and started doing push-ups. He was already in the hole. The worst punishment they have. They couldn't put him anywhere else. The most they could do is come in and brutalize him. So they did. They actually came in and beat the shit out of Huey. About 2 days after that, the guard who came around on the night shift turned out to be an old friend of Huey's. They hadn't seen each other for years, until this guard came down and found Huey in the hole. He sneaked some sandwiches down to Huey. After that, every night when this guard came on the night shift, Huey could eat. Then in the day, when the other guards came down, Huey would be doing push-ups. Every day he'd throw the food back and say, "I don't want that crap. That's not fit for human beings to eat." Huey went on like that for 10 days. It was blowing the guards' minds. Finally, one of the guards said, "How do you do this?" Huey said, "The spirit of the people is stronger than man's jails. My spirit is stronger than yours." That's the kind of thing Huey pulled off in jail, even before the Black Panther Party was organized. So from the way he taught me to deal with the jail experience, I was able to deal with Warden Moore. Of course, that doesn't mean that I like jail. I abhor it. I'm pissed off at it. But I learned to take jail, and I let the guards know that being locked up doesn't change my revolutionary spirit. And usually, when the guards discover this, they become quite interested in the philosophy of the Black Panther Party and come around asking questions and asking me to run down the 10-point platform. That's how it happens, what Warden Moore calls organizing. In the next couple of days, I wrote a number of letters. I felt that I was isolated from everything that was going on the West Coast, being in Chicago, so I wrote letters home to communicate. One of the guards came around and told me to fill out this thing to my lawyer, and I'd be able to get in touch with him right away. I filled that out, and the guard promised to mail it immediately. By now, the guards realized that I wasn't either a mad killer or a fool, as the papers depict all Black Panther Party members. The second day, I felt something crawling on me, and I realized I had caught the crabs. The only place that I could trace it to was that filthy county jail in Missouri that I had to stay at all night one night. So I went and got completely soaked down with DDT, all through my hair and my natural, everything. I had that stuff running off me like water. The next Tuesday morning, they took me out saying I was going to court. Actually, we ended up going to the federal building in Chicago. On the way, I saw Jerry Rubin. I hardly recognized him at first, with his hair all cut off. We stood in the federal processing tank in Cook County Jail for 2 hours and got to talk for a while. Jerry told me he was being kept in a tier across the hall from me, but Cook County Jail is so huge that it's like being in another jail. Cook holds as many prisoners as they do in some of the major prisons. I found out that Jerry had to stay in jail until 25 days were up. He was serving the time for blocking a Navy recruiting table in Berkeley. Jerry told me Warden Moore had been down the aisle that morning, hassling him a little, and had said, "Bobby Seale isn't Uncle Tom." I laughed and said, "Oh man, ain't this a gas?" The other day he was treating me like I was the most notorious criminal in the world. Now that he's found out I'm not a notorious criminal, I'm an Uncle Tom. Well, we can't expect Warden Moore to understand the positives of revolutionary principles. Then I told Jerry how Warden Moore had sought me out in the aisle that same morning. "Bobby Seale," he had called out. "Jerry Rubin said he would get you to beat me up." I had said Jerry Rubin might say anything. He might say that he's going to get Westmoreland to jump on Nixon. Jerry laughed at that. Then Moore himself came inside the tank. He sat down and began talking about how SDS runs the Black Panther Party. I said, "You're crazy, man." He said, "It's true, they do." I said, "I don't know what kind of papers you've been reading." Moore was walking around inside the tank, not in a uniform but in civilian clothes. Now, just outside the tank, they process guys who are going to court. Many of them don't have handcuffs on, but everyone knows they are prisoners going to court. The way Moore was sitting there, a man had no way of knowing that he was the superintendent of the jail. This cat who was getting processed for court saw Moore sitting there smoking a cigarette, so he said, "Hey man, can I get a cigarette from you?" I realized the prisoner had mistaken Moore for another prisoner, and the look of outrage on Moore's face just cracked me up laughing. Moore looked real mean at the cat and said, in a very harsh tone, "I advise you, young man, not to say one damn thing to me." The cat looked at Moore and then at me. He didn't understand this at all. Moore just turned back to me and started talking. I found out that Moore did this a lot. He'd go walking around the jail in civilian clothes. In Cook County Jail, all the prisoners wear civilian clothes, and all the guards wear uniforms. Moore goes around wearing an old t-shirt and some pants. You'd swear up and down he's a prisoner. Therefore, a lot of prisoners going to court and coming back from court won't even know who he is. They may not be very careful of what they say around him. Moore has a PhD in psychology and sociology. He figures people will always react in a certain way, so he's developed all kinds of methods of getting whatever reaction or information he wants from a prisoner. I was hip to his methods, so they didn't work on me. The next day, Wednesday, I found that I had developed an infection in my testes. The doctor examined me and said that I must be put in the hospital for some treatments. I was moved out of my cell and into the hospital ward. My constitutional rights are denied. Jerry Rubin and I were taken to the federal court on Wednesday morning, September 24th, and William Kunstler filed a motion to see me in the jail over there. He came in and said, "I heard you were talking about firing all the lawyers unless you had Gary." "Yeah," I said, "because all you cats were supposed to do for me is file motions. As far as I'm concerned, Gary is going to be my trial lawyer. He's always been my lawyer." Kunstler said that if I did that, Judge Hoffman would appoint some kind of public defender. So I told him, "Well, they can appoint me a public defender, but I ain't working with the public defender. I don't want a public defender. I want Gary. I don't want anybody but Gary." "You call Gary," I told Kunstler, "and see if I have a legal right to fire a public defender. Don't I have that right?" "Yeah, you can." "Well, that's what I'm going to do," I told him. "And if Hoffman tries to appoint you or anyone else as my lawyer, I'm going to fire you cats anyway." So Kunstler said, "The jury is about to be picked now, and you can get in touch with Gary later." "You guys get in touch with Gary for me," I said, "and then I'll sum up exactly what I'm going to do, because before this trial starts, I'm going to make sure I have proper legal defense." After that, I had a chance to meet with all the other defendants. The trial finally got underway the next day. I was in the hospital at the time, and I was allowed to keep my legal stuff with me. I saw them pick a whole jury in just one day. Meanwhile, I was waiting for a message from Gary. Finally, I got a phone call through to Gary's office on Thursday from Cook County Jail. Warden Moore called me to his office and dialed the number himself. I talked to Barney Dreyfus, Gary's law partner. I asked him if Gary was definitely going into the hospital or if he had changed his mind. Dreyfus said that the Wells case was over, but that Gary definitely had to go to the hospital the next day. His doctors had said that he'd better have that gallbladder operation right away because it would be a real danger to his life not to. "Well, I'm going to ask the judge to postpone my part of the trial so that I can have Gary," I said, "because I can't function without Gary, and I don't want these other lawyers here. Let Gary know what I'm doing, and then maybe after he gets out of the hospital, we can go on." Dreyfus mentioned that they had talked to the Panther Party Central Committee about my situation, and the Central Committee also agreed that since I had a legal right to fire the lawyers, I should do it. And boom, that's what happened. That night in the hospital, I wrote out my first motion, a request that I be allowed to fire the lawyers and postpone the trial until Charles Gary could defend me. The next morning, Friday, I got up and went to the trial. And when I got to the defense table, I told Kunstler that I was going to fire everybody. He said, "What?" I said, "Yup, everybody gets fired because Gary's definitely going into the hospital, and I'm going to ask for a firing on the basis of my part of the trial being postponed. This judge," I said, "seems to be kind of rotten. I already consider him a racist, seeing the way he's running this thing. So I've got my statement all written out. I let them read it, and one of the defendants said, 'Man, that's going to make it look like all of the defendants are splitting.' I said, 'Man, the defendants aren't splitting. I'm not splitting from you cats. It's just that my situation is very different, man, in a lot of ways. These cats stuck me on the tail end of this indictment to try and railroad me to prison. So I need Gary here, and everybody knows it. Gary's my lawyer. I haven't confirmed any of these other lawyers. I'm not going to be letting Hoffman pick and choose my lawyer for me when he knows that Gary is my lawyer, my attorney of record.' They said, 'Well, okay, that's what I'm doing,' I said. So I proceeded to exercise my constitutional rights. The marshal waved the gavel and said, 'All rise,' and everybody rose. 'The court is now in session pursuant to adjournment.' Boom, boom, boom. The Honorable Julius J. Hoffman presiding. At that point, I got up and walked to the podium and told him, I'd like to read a statement concerning my legal defense. Don't you have a lawyer? Hoffman asked. No, I said. I want to read this statement concerning my defense. So I read the statement. I got to the point in the statement where I said, and if you don't respect my constitutional rights, then I'm going to have to consider you a blatant racist who's prejudiced against all the other defendants and myself in particular. Hoffman interrupted me. What you say? A blatant racist, I replied. I consider you a racist, just like all the other judges who saw people's constitutional rights violated in the South throughout the history of this country. He didn't know where I was coming from. I was coming from the fact that he'd already denied the motion that Charles Gary had made a month before the trial started. Gary had flown to Chicago in August to try to make a motion for a postponement on the basis of the fact that he had to go into the hospital for an operation. Hoffman said my motion would be denied. Kunstler got up and said something, but I don't remember what he said. Then Len Weinglass, the other lawyer, and the other 7 defendants said they wanted to meet with me. Weinglass told the federal marshals that this and each day after the court was over in the afternoon, I would meet with them. I told the other defendants what I was going to be doing with respect to making motions concerning my constitutional rights and things like that. Every time my name came up, I stood and said, Judge Hoffman, I don't have my lawyer here. Well, young man, you have a lawyer. Mr. Kunstler's your lawyer. No, he's not my lawyer, I said, and I argued the point. During the first week or so, I got up 4 or 5 times in this manner. I tried to argue, and when I'd start saying, but Judge Hoffman, you're wrong. I have a certain constitutional right, he'd say, take the jury out. When I made that first motion, that first Friday morning, not one witness had been sworn in on the part of the prosecution. Not one. This is very important because by law the trial isn't considered to have begun until a witness is sworn in. After Schultz made his opening statement to the jury, this is still before a single witness had been sworn in, Kunstler got up and made his statement. Right after he got through, the judge asked if there were any other statements. I got up from my chair and walked to the podium. I was just getting ready to reply to what Schultz had said about how he would prove that I was guilty and that I had made a speech telling people to get pistols, rifles, and shotguns and then told them to riot. What I really said, and we have a transcript of the speech, was that every black man should put a .357 Magnum, a shotgun, and an M1 rifle in his home. In essence, what I talked about in the speech was that we have a right to defend ourselves against unjust attacks by pigs, and if the pigs attack us in an unjust manner, then we have a right to barbecue some of that pork. That's exactly what I said, but I didn't tell people to go out and riot. I told them we had a right to defend ourselves against unjust attacks, and the words in my speech say unjust. But Schultz turned it around. And we'll prove that Mr. Seale made this speech telling people to pick up guns, .357 Magnums, shotguns, etc., and go out and riot. And Schultz emphasized to the jury that Mr. Seale is a very effective speaker. He's very effective. When I got up to the podium, I was going to say, Mr. Schultz has just made a reference to me being a very effective speaker. But I want it known to the jury that I intend to prove that if I am an effective speaker, speech is directly related to my constitutional rights and everybody's constitutional rights. That's what I was going to say at first and move on from there. But all I said was, Mr. Schultz. At that point, Hoffman said, just a minute, young man, and peered down at me. I looked up at him. Who's your lawyer? Hoffman asked. Mr. Charles Gary, I said. I was getting ready to say Mr. Charles Gary, who's in the hospital in California. But when I said Mr. Charles Gary, Hoffman said, take the jury out, take the jury out. He rushed the jury out and got them out of the way. He didn't want the jurors to see the crap he was about to pull. After the jury went out, he went on to argue, and then Kunstler got up and started arguing. "You're not my lawyer," I said to Kunstler, and I argued my own case. Hoffman said something to the effect that he didn't want to listen to me, that I would not be allowed to make an opening statement because Kunstler was my lawyer. "Kunstler is not my lawyer," I said. "I fired the man." Now, I had nothing personal against Kunstler because I know that Kunstler is in the struggle and that he is supposed to be a good lawyer. I was just upholding the principle that I had a right to my own lawyer. From there on, for about 2 or 3 weeks, it was me standing up whenever my name was mentioned. Most of the time, when I stood up, Hoffman would say to Kunstler, "You are the lawyer for Mr. Seale." And I'd say, "No, he's not my lawyer. I want to request the right to have my own lawyer, Charles R. Gary here, or the right to defend myself." Hoffman didn't even investigate. He didn't care. A judge is supposed to at least investigate a person's position, especially in regard to legal defense, but he didn't. At this point, I tried to find out every piece of legal information that I could. There was a young black girl at the trial who was in law school. She came up to the defense table every once in a while, and I asked her to get me all the legal information she could. Wineglass said he would get me all the legal information he could. So they both worked it out to get me legal information concerning my right to defend myself and my right to have my own lawyer. And as I got more legal information, I began to argue more and more harder. I got hold of material about an old Reconstruction law, Section 1941 of the U.S. Government Code, that says a black man cannot be discriminated against in any manner in any court in America concerning legal defense. When I got hold of that, man, oh man, it was a real thing with me because I knew I was right by these laws and by the Sixth Amendment. Before I was gagged, Hoffman actually got to the point where he'd shout over me. I'd jump up and start talking rather fast, saying, "Judge Hoffman, you know darn well I have a right to have my own lawyer here or else a right to defend myself." He'd start talking real loud over me. "Take the jury out! Take the jury out! I don't want to hear this man. Mr. Marshall, sit that man down. Take the jury out. Take the jury out." He did this so the court reporter could only record what Hoffman was saying and not what I was saying. But I got hip to him. I saw the tactics he was using, so every time he started raising his voice, I'd raise my voice up too. Then 4 or 5 days after the trial started, the thing came up about the threatening notes to the jury. Man, that was rotten. I was sitting there in the court that morning, and all of a sudden Schultz had said something about the lawyers and the prosecution going into the chambers to talk something over. Boom! So the marshals took me with the other defendants into a room, and the lawyers came into the room and said that the jury had received some threatening notes saying, "You're being watched. Signed, the Black Panthers." What? I said, "Oh, man." Kunstler said Schultz and Foran didn't want any publicity about it. "Don't want any publicity about it?" I said. "Well, later for them punks, man. We're not going to send any stupid notes like that, man. Somebody's railroading us." I felt that Schultz and Foran knew about the whole thing, but I said to myself, even if Schultz and Foran don't know about it, then it's a government CIA operation, because they figured that Schultz and Foran would discover it and use it against me to try to prejudice the jury, because I'm the one they have absolutely no evidence against. So they need this. The U.S. government needs this thing to railroad me. I'm going to publicize this and accuse the government of doing it, because that's the only people I think would do it. Somebody said, "Well, how do you know some quack didn't send it?" "Some quack might have sent it," I told them, "but you guys get a copy of that, a Xerox copy of that stuff, and send it to a handwriting expert and find out what kind of person wrote the notes. and I'll bet 10 to 1 we're going to find a person who relates to some kind of authority in this system. So I wrote out a statement saying that I believed that the U.S. government sent the note to trick us, and that the Black Panther Party never signs anything. The Black Panthers. If we signed anything, it's signed Black Panther Party. And we don't send notes. It's some of the same crap that happened during Huey P. Newton's trial when they railroaded Huey. The same business about threatening letters and threatening notes. When Huey got on the stand during that trial, and when Huey really started explaining the true philosophy of the Black Panther Party, a lot of those jurors took time to objectively check Huey out. They found out that Huey was a very intelligent person. He wasn't what the DA was trying to make him out to be. More than likely, I thought then, they are hip to this now, and the government wants to destroy me in the hands of the jury before I can take the stand or gain the right to defend myself. I reacted very strongly to that note, realizing that no one else but the CIA or the FBI could have sent it. If Schultz and Foran did know about it, then they sent it. But I thought probably the CIA did it. The CIA has done some dirty, rotten work. They started the Cuban thing. They were behind Vietnam and escalating that war, and in all the other murders and operations that they've been involved in. They just sit on the side and never say a thing. We would compare the SS in Germany with the CIA, because the government uses them as the behind-the-scenes police state operation. Anyway, that's the way I saw it and felt it. With all the infiltrating operations that they tried to pull on the Black Panther Party, I could only see it that way, and that's the way I reacted to it. From there on, I began to get a few legal points about my right to defend myself, and I argued more vigorously. Judge Hoffman started shouting over me so the recorder wouldn't hear things, but I talked loud enough so she could hear me, and argued with him to the point of calling him a fascist, a racist, and a pig, and using that right in the context of my argument. No judge wants to be called a fascist, a racist, and a pig, but that's what he was acting like, running over my constitutional rights like that and just ignoring them. I'm going to use this in my arguments in every point, I said to myself, and that just might persuade him to understand that I really want him to investigate. He finally did investigate, 3 days after he gagged me. Tom Hayden and Len Weinglass said they wanted to go and see Charles R. Gary about my being gagged, and Hoffman knew he had gotten out of hand in gagging me. Then he tried to say there was a precedent for gagging me, but Hoffman was a stone liar, because I had gotten hold of legal information on the other cats who had been gagged in court, and these cats had picked up chairs and thrown them at people. I had never picked up chairs and thrown them. I had never run up into the jury box and shaken the jurors' shoulders. I never did things like that. The only thing I ever said to the jury after those threatening letters was, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. I hope you don't blame me for anything." Hoffman was rushing the jury out and trying to talk over my voice, because threatening letters that were supposed to be sent by the Black Panther Party were not sent by the Black Panther Party. And Judge Hoffman, you know it, and this whole court knows it. Hoffman was talking at the same time I was. I don't think the court recorder got it all. I don't think the court recorder was against me. I don't think she was on my side, but I got a message from someone folded up in a piece of paper saying that the court recorder said, "When you speak out, please talk slower so I can get it all on record. It's in your defense." I began to feel that people were really getting on the judge, because I even found out that a couple of the marshals didn't dig what Hoffman was doing. Behind the scenes in the lockup, they'd shake their heads. They had some deputy marshals in the court who were actually guards over at the Cook County Jail and who worked the late shift at night. When they got off in the morning, they'd come over and get in their civilian clothes and work a day shift as special deputy marshals. Most of the cats I saw in Cook County Jail in the morning before I come over to the court were marshals at the trial. The guards turned out and got on my side because of the way Hoffman was treating me. The guards, everybody asked questions. I just don't see how the judge could do that. And some would just shake their heads. One morning they attempted to remove members of my family from the courtroom. I got up and I protested about that, and I called the judge a racist again. It was actually an old court matron who seemed to be the cause of it all. Every time I looked around at her, she'd almost be breathing down their necks, breathing down the necks of every Black Panther Party member and black person in the courtroom. They had put them all in one little section, and she was looking at each one of them, at every little move they made. All of a sudden, she told some chick to get out, and another cat to get out. They weren't being noisy, but she was getting them out of the courtroom. Counselor got up and said, "Why are they removing black people from the courtroom?" "It looks like a bit of racism to me," I said, "because the black people weren't carrying on at all." Then one morning one of the marshals came back into the lockup before court had started and says, "Bobby, you've got a lot of Black Panthers, a lot of black people out there that's on your side today. I hope nothing happens." "Well, nothing's gonna happen," I said. "They're here to observe. They've got a right to observe. They got a right to be in here." "Well, the judge told us to go over and sit you down, and I just don't want any of them to start anything." "They're not going to start anything," I replied. "When you guys are pushing me down in chairs and stuff like that, you're carrying out a racist judge's orders. He's making you act in a racist manner." "Well, I'm really not a racist." I said, "Yeah, you say you aren't, but I'll talk to them." 5 minutes later, they came back and got me. Court still hadn't started. All the defendants were scattered around the defense table. Schultz and Foran were around the prosecution's table. I said, "Brothers and sisters in the audience, I want to say a few things to you. You've been noticing for the past few weeks in this courtroom that I've been threatened by the judge, and they're talking about gagging me and all this kind of crap. But I have a right to speak out in my own behalf. A few days before, I had gotten into an argument with Judge Hoffman, and I asked him, and this is in the court record, do I have a right or do I not have a right to stand up and make requests and motions and speak in behalf of myself on those requests and motions?" Give or take a few words, I said just that. Hoffman never answered me as to whether I did or did not have that right. That's very important, because he should have said, "No, you don't have a right to stand up and speak out in behalf of yourself." All he said was, "You have a lawyer." "I'm contending that I don't have a lawyer," I said to Hoffman, pointing out that I had fired Kunstler, and you can't appoint him for me. "Do I or do I not have a right to speak out in behalf of myself, in making a request or a motion, and in fact arguing that motion?" Then I said, "This is a request and a motion," just like that, but Hoffman wouldn't answer me on it. So I was speaking to the cats in the audience, and I was telling them that I had a right to speak out in behalf of myself and wanted to defend myself. But I don't want you cats out there to get upset and get emotional and start doing anything that's out of the ordinary, I said. You got a right to be participants here. You got a right to observe this trial and see what's going on. If anything happens, don't do anything unnecessary. If anybody attacks us, we defend ourselves. That's the principle of the party, whether they have a gun or not. If they attack us, we defend ourselves. If they make us leave the courtroom, they just make us leave the courtroom. We leave. But don't anybody do anything. Keep your cool. We're human beings and we got a right to defend ourselves. But don't do anything. Just be cool, because I still have a right to speak out in behalf of myself. The court convened, and Schultz got up and said very nasty like, "If the court please," before you came into this courtroom, "if the court please," Bobby Seale stood up and addressed this group. Schultz tried to make it sound real bad. He was up there talking, and I jumped up and walked to the lectern and said, "I can speak on behalf of my constitutional rights too." Then I went back to my seat and went to sit down. Marshals were moving all around the room about to charge me. They were really coming in on me, man. Schultz still tried to say that I had spoken about attacking people. I stood up again. The marshals ran over to me, grabbed me, and the big one hit me. He grabbed me and pushed me at the same time. He pushed me back in the seat when I stood up. When I hit the seat, the whole seat went back over and I hit the floor. The chair didn't go all the way on the floor, but I was sitting right in front of some of the audience and spectators. The chair had wheels on it and rolled back at the same time I was being pushed. When the chair went back, my leg came up. When the marshal pushed me down, my leg came up and it hit the bottom of the defense table. At the same time, another cat, a big tall cat we called Slim, came up, pulled my arm, and put it in a hammerlock. "Hey man, you're hurting me." Now this was Slim trying to do his job, but at the same time trying not to mess up with me. He pulled my arm back down and held it there. He said, "Hey man, be cool." "No man," I said, and I was really yelling out. I started yelling out then. "You're lying, dirty liar." I told them to defend themselves. "You are a rotten, racist, pig, fascist liar. That's what you are. You are a rotten liar. You're a fascist, pig, liar." Schultz continued at this point, telling the judge that I was trying to disrupt the court. "Schultz, why don't you tell the truth?" I shouted. "Why don't you tell the truth about exactly what I said?" But this time, the marshals had let me go. "Why don't you tell the truth about exactly what I said?" What I said was, "Be cool and don't do anything. We have a right to defend ourselves if attacked." I didn't say anything like what you're trying to insinuate. Isn't that right? Tell the truth. I hollered at him. And you know what Schultz did? He says, "Yes, Your Honor, I'm sorry. Your Honor will understand, I'm sure." And Schultz went and sat down. I had caught him in a bold-faced lie. The same day, Schultz passed around a photograph of a black cat wearing a t-shirt with a clenched fist on it. "Power to the people salute." Schultz said, "I want to enter this photograph in evidence." It's a picture of a black man in a sweatshirt, and on that sweatshirt there is a clenched fist, black power salute. I stood up at that point and said, "I object to the characterization of the evidence. It's not correct. The salute is directly related to the Black Panther Party, which started it. It really means power to the people. To characterize it and isolate it that way only as part of the Black Power movement is very racist." Schultz jumped out of his chair. He was turning red, man. Mad. "Your Honor," he says in a very loud voice and trying to make it sound derogatory, "Mr. Seale has called me a racist, Your Honor, and he has called you a racist." "That's right," I said. "That's exactly what you are if you're going to characterize evidence like that. You are a racist, Your Honor." I repeated, "It's a mischaracterization. It's the power to the people salute, and it's not just isolated to black power. Black people in the Black Panther Party initiated it, but what we mean by it is power to all the people." That was another form of defending myself. Schultz finally had to sit down. They really had gotten to a point where they didn't want to have anything else to do with me. When they started trying to misconstrue things that pointed directly at me, I had no other alternative but to speak out on behalf of myself, or at least to object, because I had a right to defend myself, although Hoffman continued to deny me that right. Some of these things the jury was able to see, although most times Hoffman rushed the jury out of the room.